Thank you, Lorna. Yes, we will be circulating the slides. And as Adiba has mentioned, we'll be recording today's presentation, and that recording has now begun. So thank you for that. We now have 46 people on the call, which is excellent. I think we did have quite a few signed up who may join in a few minutes. However, I'm very keen that as chair, I try and keep us to time. So let's see how that goes. But we will make a start. And to introduce myself, I'm Sam Gomersall. I'm a program lead at the Council for Disabled Children, which is a part of the RISE partnership, which I'll speak into a little bit more in a few minutes' time. Adiba, can we go on to the next slide if that's all right? Fantastic. So whilst there's probably a few too many people to do full introductions, it would be great if you could put in the chat your name and the organisation you're representing in today's call, so we get a real flavour of who's on the call with us today. Next slide, if that's all right, Adiba. So just a few quick reminders. Please mute when you join, unless obviously you're a speaker. A couple of top tips there around how you can see the slides and how you might want to turn on the captions as well. And just to assure people, there'll be an opportunity for a question and answer session after each of the speakers' sections, and then a longer opportunity at the end of today's webinar for some broader reflections from the audience on what you've heard, but also maybe more broadly on co-production and engagement in general. However, we are going to just get a quick flavour of where people are at with regard to co-production and engagement more generally. So we've got a quick Menti poll. Hopefully this is going to work. Let's see. But if you wouldn't mind scanning the QR code and answering these two questions for us, that would be amazing. So how confident would you feel explaining what good co-production looks like to a colleague or a parent? And how confident do you feel co-producing within your current role? I'll give you a couple of minutes to have a look through that. Adiba, question to you is: are we going to be able to see the results on the screen, or is that wishful thinking at my end? Amazing. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So looking at that first question, it looks like we've got quite a few people's responses there. So we've got 13 in the kind of confident, a few in the very confident, and some at the slightly confident, and then some around the somewhat confident as well. My maths is not that good, so I can't work out exactly how many. There's in the bottom right-hand corner, there says a 34. Reminder that you can click on Hannah's link in the chat as well if you couldn't access the QR code. And then the second question. Okay. So this one's maybe slightly less in terms of how confident you actually feel co-producing within your current role. But we've still got quite a few in the confident and also in the very confident. Thank you, Adiba. We'll stop sharing if that's okay. Thank you for taking part in that. Hopefully the tech will work there. It looked like it did. Adiba, are we all right to share the slides again? Amazing. So just to kind of give you a bit of a flavour, I said I would introduce the Rise partnership and what we do. There's three key aims of the Rise partnership. Next slide, I think, Eddie, if that's okay. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Um, Great. So three key elements of the RISE partnership. The first is targeted support for local areas. So an issue might have a local area send partnership might have a specific issue that they want to address, maybe something around EHCPs or co-production, and we go in and try and support them through workshops, desk reviews, focus groups to help them address that issue. The second is a program of national webinars, national events, e-learning modules and training sessions to try and support the SEND workforce to develop. And thirdly, and we'll hear a little bit more about this today, we aim to disseminate and communicate what works in SEND through the What Works in SEND program and website, and we'll explain a little bit more about that coming up. So today you'll hear from 4 different speakers, which we hope will give you a real flavour of what we're trying to do through the RISE programme and what I've just explained there. Firstly, you'll hear research from the University of Warwick into what good co-production looks and feels like. Then we'll hear from Louise Chandler, a speaker, writer and expert by experience on the power and purpose of co-production. And finally, we'll hear from Kieran Pearce, who will speak into an example of how co-production looked and hopefully felt in practice in Essex. But a quick caveat first around terminology, which we know is really important. I've put on the screen there 9 different words which are often used, or terms that are used in the context of involvement and participation of those with lived experience. And I'm sure there are other words that you've come across that you've heard about that are also used. I don't want to duplicate too much of Warwick's presentation, but we know that terminology really does matter, and it can act as a barrier for accessibility. In today's webinar, we know that we also really want to create a kind of safe space. And so I guess we ask that there's an understanding that people may be using these terms in slightly different ways to ways that you've seen them used before. And that's okay, and we can work through that and try and support each other to develop that shared understanding, which is so vital. On the next slide, you'll see a kind of screenshot from a game, which we will send to you afterwards, where you can test yourself on those words. I'm going to skip past this slide now because I don't want you to memorize the answers, but we will make sure that we send that out. Just to continue that theme of terminology, we also just wanted to start today with a couple of definitions. However, in the first workshop, we'll also hear another one, and crucially, we know that there are different ways of defining co-production. Having said that, the kind of things that are in bold on this screen, I think, speak to 2 key elements of co-production. The first is that they recognise power dynamics, and co-production, I guess, has an attempt to equalise the power dynamics and the partnerships that are at play. And secondly, they prioritise involvement at the earliest stage. As I mentioned, we'll also hear another definition in a few minutes from our first speaker. Next slide, please, if that's all right. But we just wanted to raise first up that co-production is not the only method of participation or involvement. And we often share this particular model that you can see on the screen with local area SEND partnerships when we're running workshops. In particular, this model refers to co-production with children and young people. And this model is non-hierarchical, and it suggests that each of the 5 different methods or degrees of participation are equally valuable, but they all crucially meaningfully involve children and young people. You may have seen a kind of ladder of co-production in a similar way, and that works slightly differently, where there is a hierarchy in some way. This is a version of this which is non-hierarchical. Next slide, if that's all right, and our final slide. Um, we also wanted to just share this one before I hand over to the University of Warwick. This model is from an academic, Laura Lundy, and you can see in the centre of the diagram here that her model provides a way of conceptualising a right to participation as laid out in Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of a Child. The four elements that she mentions are space, voice, audience, and influence. And we often speak about children and young people's voice, but voice isn't enough on its own. And if we don't give children and young people access to the right spaces, audiences, and crucially, how they can then influence decision making and commissioning, then maybe we're only allowing children and young people to speak into a void um, or a vacuum. So when we're thinking about co-production, we thought it'd be helpful just to set the framework of what we mean by co-production, participation, and now I'm going to hand over to University of Warwick, Minu Paja Patel, and also Garling from CDC. Over to you.
Morning. Thanks, Sam. Morning, everybody. Hope you're all well. And as Sam said, my colleague Garling and I are going to be talking to you this morning about co-production in SEND services. As Sam said, I'm from the University of Warwick and I've been undertaking this research since June last year. And the report is nearly ready, and this morning is a chance to share some of the learning with you in the hope that it might resonate with you, might inspire you, and might perhaps give you some ideas that you can take back and use in your own workplaces. So the research was commissioned by CDC and the Department for Education, and the idea was to find out what good looks like in co-production across SEND services. So I've spent the last few months speaking to people about SEND services, how they're designed, developed, and evaluated. So services like education, health, and social care. And I've learned quite a lot about how this happens across the different services, and how in some places the services are really well designed and they fit the people who use them. And in other places, they're designed by experts. Before I move on to talk about the research, I just want to explain, and I know Sam's already touched on this, why co-production matters when it comes to SEND services. Could I get the next slide, please? I forgot I had to do that. Right, sorry, the next slide after that. Thank you. Brilliant. Okay. So co-production is regarded as an important way to make services more equal and tailored to needs. Many services have an obligation to use co-production, and there is a requirement for area SEND inspections with Ofsted and CQC to report both on how children, young people and families are actively engaged with and how well their needs are identified and understood in areas. So one of the first things I did when it came to this research on co-production was speak to young people about what they thought. And I spoke to Flair, who are a diverse group of young people with SEND who work together to share their views with the Department for Education and other organisations. And the first thing they told me was that I needed to change the title. So they added in the feel. They said I needed to find out what good looks and feels like in co-production. So that was the first thing, and a pretty important thing that was amended to start with. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for those of you who are interested, these are the research aims and the objectives. I won't go through all of them with you, but you can see them there. So I was tasked with finding examples of good co-production across England and working out what helped and hindered in each area, as well as exploring the impact of co-production. I thought you might be interested in who I spoke to, and I will talk about that in a little while as well. But it's important to kind of say that I did speak to a wide range of practitioners, from directors of children's services to social workers to youth participation workers. There was a wide range. I spoke to discos and virtual school heads, and an absolute range of services and people took part in the research, which was fantastic. But I didn't have the same set of people in each area. I just want to sort of make that clear at the beginning. Okay, next slide, please. Again, as Sam's already touched on this morning, when I began the research, I quickly found that there are lots and lots of definitions of co-production, co-design, co-creation, whatever you want to call it. Each person I spoke to had a slightly different version of it. There was a blank sheet of paper, the ladder, the Lundy model, to name a few, and Sam's named another one this morning. But the young people from Flair gave me a definition, and that's what you can see there on the screen. And you can see that from their definition, they understood that there's a need for pragmatism, working together and hoping for an outcome that works not just for them, but for everyone, for practitioners, commissioners. It wasn't just about them. They understood that. They wanted collaboration, but they wanted respect for their lived experience and the views of others in order to hopefully come up with effective outcomes that work for everyone. And they wanted to be able to co-produce in a safe space that was accessible for them. So not in kind of, offices that they couldn't reach at times that they couldn't be there. So that's the definition that I'm going to be referring to. But each place that I went to, we asked them about their definitions, and I touch on that later. Okay, next slide, please. I'm just going to move on to the methods that we used. So as I said, there was the workshop with Flair initially to discuss their views on the co-production research. Then I had monthly meetings with an advisory group. Early on, it was hopes that perhaps the research could be co-produced, but with the timescales that we had, we realised quickly that this wouldn't be possible. So instead, I worked with the advisory group and the young people. Parent carers and practitioners made up the advisory group, and we collaborated together to kind of design the research methods. They met with me each month and sort of put me back on track on where I was. I updated them on what was going on, and they gave me ideas on what should be amended and things. So it was very much a case of working as co-productively as possible. Not I'm the researcher and I know what I'm doing. I was very much aware that this research, if it was going to be valid and mean anything, needed to be informed by the people with the lived experience, and the practitioners who work with them. So that's what we aim to do with the research and the research methods. So the advisory group explained to me that I needed to do an online survey at the beginning of the research, whereas I'd originally had it at the end. So we amended it so that the research survey went out first. And the idea behind the survey was to give as many people as possible a chance to comment and share their views on co-production. So the survey was disseminated as widely as possible by a huge host of local authorities, Department for Education, voluntary, charitable, social enterprises, anyone and everyone that I could get hold of, my own sort of academic network. And it was disseminated and it was left open for about 4 or 5 months. And the idea was that people could share their views about what they thought good co-production was. And they did share their views, and I'll touch on those shortly. So the online survey, we had 360 respondents. It was quite representative as compared to perhaps the interviews. And then the interviews across the 4 case studies, there were 56 people that I spoke to in total. The areas that for the case studies were generated by the online survey, well, 3 of the 4 of them were. So I felt confident that I was being told, sort of hearing it from the horse's mouth, I think the expression is, this is where you should go and look. There's some good co-production going on here. So that's what I did. Okay, at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Garling, who's going to explain a little bit more about what the young people have done to inform this research. Garling.
Thanks, Mino. Hi, everyone. A participating program manager at the Council for Disabled Children. So, as Minu spoke about, part of this research involved inviting children and young people to input, share their experiences of co-production, or sort of what they think it should really look like. Our involvement in this work sort of had 2 elements to it. So
Darling, is there any way you might be slightly muted in some way? I don't know. It might be a case of not shouting, but maybe speaking a bit louder if that's possible, if that's the only kind of
Does that
way
help?
through it.
I've changed the microphone.
It's still a little bit quiet. I mean, I can hear, but I yeah. Do you want to keep speaking and that will test it?
Okay, let's see. So our involvement in the work had two elements to it. Am I at all louder now?
It's slightly louder.
Okay.
Maybe if
I can hear it perfectly, so I think,
perfect.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think maybe other people can turn up their
Yeah.
sound whilst you're talking, and then we can turn it down again.
I have just got a new laptop given to me by the office.
It's really clear for me.
That's slightly better, yeah.
Okay, let's try like this. Okay, we'll just give it a go.
That's miles better.
Okay, thank you everyone. So our involvement in this piece of work had two elements to it. So we had input from our FLARE group. So as Mooney said, that's our Young Send Advisory Group to Department for Education. They're from all over England and come together every other month to feed into different areas of Department for Education's work. And we also involved the young people who attended our Youth Voice Matters conference in February 2025. So this is sort of an event that's all about developing the skills you need to sort of share your voice, be involved in strategic participation and be involved in decision making. And that event is for disabled children, young people and those with special education needs from across England. So these engaging with these two different groups sort of worked at different times. So the FLARE group, I think, were involved sort of towards the beginning of the research, and their feedback was used to design interview and focus group questions for the case study areas. And then the young people attending our conference were sort of involved towards the end of this, and their feedback it will be used in upcoming webinars and presentations and in the final report to the Department for Education to support their approach to working with children and young people. So these young people are giving a fantastic opportunity to share their views in specific elements of the research, and it was great to give them the opportunity to sort of be consulted and share their ideas. We brought this sort of conversation to these children and young people because the FLARE group and the young people attending our national conference sort of are from like a broad range of like different areas across England and have really varied lived experience of disability and special educational needs. FLARE as an advisory group are also able to reflect on children, young people's experiences quite widely. So they're experts in discussing how disabled children, young people and those with special educational needs want to receive the support and services they need. And we were able to build on previous conversations as part of other projects on co-production and how young people want to work with local areas, services and so on. We had at Youth Voice Matters around 100 children and young people, and then on top of FLARE, and probably had about 120 children take part in this, so that was great. And also these young people bring like a range of perspectives and experiences. So some will have had experience of working in co-production, others will have worked with organisations, services in different ways, maybe co-design, consultation, youth-led. So it was great to bring that in. Just to finish, our sort of key considerations when engaging children and young people were sort of about context, so making sure the young people taking part sort of understood what co-production meant in this context. It is a term that gets used a lot. So to support young people to feedback, we spoke to them about what co-production means, what this looks like in this specific context. So maybe working with local areas and services, and highlighted what is sort of specific to working in co-production compared to other forms of engagement. We created just a safe space to share ideas, reflect on experiences and ask questions. We would try to be really clear about the scope of the research and how their feedback will be used. And session design, just sort of thinking about accessibility, so asking questions in a way that children and young people can sort of understand, relate to, making activities fun and engaging, and trying to like effectively record a very large group of children's feedback. So I'm going to hand back to me now. Thanks everyone for bearing with me with my mic issues.
Thanks, Carly. Yeah, the young people have been great, and the Youth Voice Matters conference was absolutely amazing, and it was really great that what they were saying completely resonated with what the findings had been from the research. So I found that quite satisfying, that it kind of all joined up in the end. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the survey that I was mentioning earlier, which started at the beginning of the research and ran throughout the data collection period, allowed people to access and share their views. And as I was saying, it was more diverse than the interview participants. I won't go through all the details, but we did have a range of ages and ethnicities, which, I would have liked to have had more of that, perhaps with some of the practitioners in the case study areas. People did share their views. We had over 11,000 words on their views on co-production, much of which was negative, as you can imagine, lots and lots of parent carers sharing their views. But there were also many positives about what co-production can do. And there was a lot of hope about, if co-production is used well, what might be possible for SEND services and service users. So that was really good. Next slide, please. Thank you. Participants were very clear in their views that co-production done well at both the operational and the strategic levels can make a huge positive impact on the efficiency and effectiveness of SEND services. One of the participants said, if co-production is done right, it can be life-changing for those accessing the services. SEND children and SEND adults should be the priority, and their views should be the most important. Professionals only have observational views. Parents can relay useful information, but those with SEND have the most insight and they will be the most effective. So there was a real feeling that children and young people needed to be involved with this co-production work, and it wasn't just parent carers and practitioners, that we needed to make sure that children and young people had their say. So it's great that we were able to do that for the research. Next slide, please. I haven't got time to talk about the survey findings in any more detail, but they will be in the research report if anyone is interested in looking at that any further. So there were 4 case study areas of what participants felt was good co-production: Rochdale, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and the South West. And it's important to note that the research is based on the views of the participants, not just the views of practitioners, but children, young people, and parents. And so there were more practitioners that I spoke to, because obviously they're easier to access and therefore recruit. But I did try to make sure that as many of those with lived experience and families were involved as possible. So these are the 4 areas that I looked at. Within these areas, there are examples of good co-production. So there is no way that this research is saying that the whole of the Southwest is doing good co-production. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that. So I am talking about specific aspects, specific examples within those areas. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that I've spoken to 9 people and I'm claiming that I know what's going on across the whole of the Southwest, because that's not at all what I'm saying. Next slide, please. So what did we find out? In terms of facilitators, there were several, and I'll start with perhaps the most important: relationships and trust. These were key, and I guess it's not really surprising, but the relationship and trust between practitioners, across and within departments, with children and young people and practitioners, and then parent carers and practitioners, were essential. Co-production, or whatever you want to call it and however you're defining it, cannot work without that relationship building and that trust. And it was really, really obvious in places that were doing it well that those relationships were there, and people weren't like, well, that's not my department. Everyone was sort of working together to make sure that the system met the needs that it was put together to do. So that was really, really important. And it was also one of the barriers, which I'll talk about in a moment. Transparent communication was really important. Things like sharing agendas with participants ahead of meetings, and letting them know where a meeting was and checking that they could get there and things. That was really kind of crucial. Having the flexibility to have meetings outside of office hours, which may suit practitioners but don't necessarily suit parent carers or young people who might be in school or employment. So that was really important. Another facilitator was using sort of creative methods, so graffiti boards. There was some of that at the Youth Voice Matters event as well. So using more creative methods, maybe not sitting down at a table with lots and lots of documents, but getting people's views in other ways so that they're able to kind of share and it's more accessible. Technology was another one. People were using software so that things could be available and documents could be available in other languages, or text was made larger. So those kind of things that were making things more accessible so that those participating in co-production could participate fully and understand what was going on. So they weren't turning up at a meeting to suddenly be given a load of papers. They had them in advance, they had the minutes, and that really made a huge difference in them actually being able to participate and contribute effectively. Leadership buy-in was key. So a lot of this work was going on at kind of ground level with practitioners, but the leadership did matter. So leaders needed to be loud and clear that co-production mattered, and everyone, SEND was everyone's business, and everyone needed to be involved in listening to the voice of those with lived experience. But there were also lots of barriers. Time constraints was one of the key ones, really. Having a 3-week turnaround to return some documents perhaps to central government or, the board at a local authority makes it difficult to do co-production. So that is an issue. Staff churn is also another one, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. It's a tricky job working in SEND services, and there is a huge turnover in many, many places, which has an impact then on relationships. So it was a real problem where you'd build up relationships, have a group doing some really good work, but then someone would move on or someone would go off with stress and things would break down. So that was a big barrier. Funding, I don't even need to say anything about that really. Resources, and then a lack of commitment sometimes to collaboration. In some places, in some departments, in some teams, if they weren't fully committed to listening to the voice of lived experience, then that could be a barrier as well. Thank you. Next slide, please. Obviously, having spoken to so many people and having so much data, there was an awful lot of good practice that I saw, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of examples today briefly. So I haven't got as much time as I would have liked. The whole 2 hours would have been nice. But one of the places that I went to was Hertfordshire, and they did some work with young people on their youth centre at Waltham Cross. So the young people were involved in co-production. They talked to the designers, the building contractors, the centre was being refurbished, and they told them what they wanted. And they worked with them to kind of design the areas they wanted. So they wanted a quiet sensory space. They wanted to improve the music studio. They wanted colour changing lights, different floor textures, bean bags, sensory toys. And then outside they wanted a gym, a dance studio, group work area, a vegetable garden, all of these amazing things that would really help them and really help meet their needs. So the group of young people with SEND got to actually work at the kind of, bottom up until the whole centre was designed with their input. So they weren't just choosing paint colours or consulted, but then nobody listened. They were actually co-producing something and then seeing the results of it. And that is really important. So that's a great example. Another example in Buckinghamshire, where the adult social care team have been working co-productively with parent carers and young people to help make sure that local services meet the needs of the local communities. One of the parents that worked on the projects had previously had huge conflict with the local authority. They have 3 children with SEND, and they'd constantly been battling the local authority for this, that, and the other over the years. But this project and the training that they did with the Social Care Institute for Excellence on co-production really turned things around. And they worked together, made incredible progress, and put together a carers improvement project, assessment and care and support plans. It's completely changed the relationship of that parent with that group of people, not with the whole of Buckinghamshire and all the services like the SEND team, but certainly the power of co-production was evident with this group, and the work that they've been doing, I think, will have a huge impact across many of the young people in Buckinghamshire. Next slide, please. Okay, there are lots and lots of examples, but in summary, good co-production looks and feels like being on the red carpet. It's like you matter. It's like you've been heard, and sometimes for the first time ever, people are listening to you. So it's the simple things that matter. Having meetings where people can attend easily, get there on the bus, paying someone's travel expenses, having lunch when they get there, so that if they've come out during, a time of day when they would normally have been having their lunch, you're actually providing it for them to say, we can't always pay you for the work you're doing in co-production, but look, you matter, and we've got some lunch for you. So it was the small things that made people feel valued, that made them feel like they mattered. And for many of them, that was absolutely huge. Sam, can I just check how long I've got, please? So,
You've got 5 more minutes left of the slot, of
Okay.
which we would have taken the questions as within that 5 minutes. So
all right. Okay.
yeah, potentially a few more minutes and then time for one question.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Next slide, please. This, I think, is the most important part of the research, is the impact aspect. So one of the questions was to find out the impact of co-production, and the impact on SEND services and the impact on young people and the impact on parent carers and practitioners is actually really, really substantial. And I think I'd like to stress the importance of this with co-production, because lots of the places that I went to are doing good co-production, and that's why I was there and that's why I was talking to them. But they aren't necessarily measuring the impact of their good co-production. So they're counting things like how many parents contacted the helpline, how many young people attended a meeting, or how many young people went to a clinic appointment, but they're not necessarily counting the impact of that effectively, is what I would suggest. So if it's increasing self-confidence in young people, or they're getting skills that they might use to then go on and get a job or go into training, that's not being measured. And it's really, really important that areas are measuring that. And I know it's one more thing to do on top of everything else, but I think if we were measuring it, we could show and clearly see for practitioners the impact that doing co-production can have in terms of outcomes. So I think that's really, really key. And the impact of co-production on young people was massively evident. The Youth Voice Matters conference was, saying it loud and clear. It has a huge impact on them. It's reducing exclusion. It's helping them find confidence, friendships, reducing loneliness. It's phenomenal, the impact that it can have. And I know we're hearing from a young person after this session, and I'm sure that Kieran as well will have lots of examples of the impact it can have. So I think measuring that impact is becoming increasingly important, and we need to do that so that we can show co-production actually matters and probably saves money in lots of the things that we are doing. Next slide, please. I'm sure the slides are going to be shared with you, so I won't go through this now, but young people were very clear about the impact it had on them, and it was, substantial. Next slide, please. Parent carers, again, were very clear about the impact it had on them. And I think one of the things with parent carers is that they are absolutely exhausted and they never have any time for themselves because they're always battling or working to support their young people. And co-production really can help break down some of those barriers and give them some time for themselves and actually help them realise that they do matter and people are listening, which I think can be life-changing, in whether it means that, it has an impact on the number of GP appointments they have, or whether they can actually go out and have some time for themselves to do something different because services are meeting the needs that they should be meeting, then it can be life-changing for them, really. Okay, next slide, please. The impact on SEND services I've talked about briefly already with some of the examples, but it is having a big change in the areas that are doing co-production. So I talked to one area where they had changed the clinical setting. So they'd completely changed the waiting room. Young people didn't want to come into a sterile white waiting room. They changed it to make it much more inviting based on some co-production work. And it actually meant that young people were coming to appointments more easily, waiting in the room because it felt more sort of warm and inviting for them, and actually attending appointments that were then having an impact on their well-being. And that was really important. And there are lots and lots of examples in the report of this happening in different SEND services across those different areas. Next slide, please. Okay, I've got a huge list of considerations and strategies and learning that might be helpful to you in your areas, but I haven't got time to go through them now. I'm happy to answer any questions about them, and they are on all the slides. And as I say, the research report will have more detail on it. Okay, shall I stop there, Sam?
Thank you. Did you?
Okay.
I don't know if you caught one of the questions in the chat was whether there was a link to the research report, and I know that you have put that on your Q&A. So If you
Yes.
want to just touch on that.
Yeah, the report isn't finished. Well, it's not had been approved by DFE yet. So once it is approved, that's where it will be published. My email's there, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. I could witter on about this and share stuff all day. So yeah, thank you for listening. Thanks, Sam.
Mene, thank you so much. And Garling and Mene, thank you very much for taking the time to go through this research. It's really extensive, and there's so much in there that I think could be of such value to local areas, professionals, children and young people. So thank you for taking the time to go through that. As I've mentioned in the chat, please feel free to write any questions that you might have, and hopefully Minu and Garling can answer them in written form as well. I am though going to hand over to Louise, and we are just about on time, and Louise, I believe, is going to speak into the impact and importance of accessible co-production. Over to you, Louise.
Hello.
Hiya.
Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Perfect. Can you move to the next slide, please? And the next one. So yeah, hi everyone. My name is Louise. I'm a young person with lived experience, and I have been involved in co-production now for around 8 years, which always feels incredibly exciting to say. I've worked across health, social care, education and research across local levels, regional and nationally. And reflecting kind of on my experiences, I can say that co-production has completely changed my life. I went from feeling as a young person quite isolated and kind of powerless to change the experiences that we as young people are having in services, to now having a community of other young people with shared experiences and using the skills that I've learned daily as part of my job. And I was really pleased to hear that talked about earlier around young people using those skills. But above all, the best part of the work that I do is seeing services and policy changed and better meet young people's needs. I work as a speaker, writer and trainer in all things neurodiversity and mental health, as well as working in research, which is now my full-time job, which is very exciting. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be kind of sharing some of the examples of the co-production work that I've been involved in. There are 3 sort of examples I've chosen to sort of represent the different types of involvement across kind of local, national and regional involvement. And I'm also going to be talking about the impact of each piece of work, because I'm a big advocate for generally kind of acknowledging and owning the impact of co-production, and working to ensure it's communicated to not just the people involved, but even wider to that, stakeholders and kind of other interested groups. It's one of the things I don't think we always talk about enough. So one of the first kind of co-production projects I was ever involved in actually was redesigning the waiting room and garden at our local CAMS service. So CAMS is the Children and Young People's Mental Health Service, for anyone who doesn't know. And as young people, we felt that the waiting area for CAMS looked old, worn out and not aimed at our age group. The garden outside was so overgrown that young people could not even go in it. We wanted to bring in the kind of colour, the warmth, the homely feel to make children and young people and their families kind of feel at ease when visiting. As you can see from the pictures, it does feel very clinical and quite scary in the sort of initial pictures. And we wanted young people to have a space where they could have time outside or have a kind of break from sessions if they needed. And the views and involvement of young people with lived experience was involved at every stage. So this included kind of brainstorming the ideas that would be helpful, deciding what changes would have the biggest impact, creating the vision, and then sort of designing all of the building and painting all the benches in the garden, designing quotes and art. We spent several days kind of doing up the garden itself, and we're involved all the way through. And this created kind of a more welcoming space for young people. It gave a brighter and warmer feeling, and young people felt that more comfortable coming to their appointments because it was a space that suited their needs. It also created that kind of trust and ownership and belonging with like services that young people might have had really quite bad experiences with. We got to know professionals on a human level, and they also better understood our needs. There was also a big kind of staff wellbeing element in the fact that staff had their lunch in the garden every day and were able to have kind of a space where they could all go outside. So it had that kind of, not necessarily the initial sort of aim of the project, but I think co-production has positive impacts in ways that we don't always realise as well. Next slide, please. So I'm really pleased that the Youth Voice Matters has had the shout out it already deserves this morning. But I am a big fan of the Youth Voice Matters conference, which is the annual conference for disabled children and young people by disabled children and young people. And it is designed to give young people the opportunity to develop their skills in terms of participation and youth involvement, but also give us the opportunity to recognise our power to make change. And as the Department of Education Advisory Group, FLAIR, which I'm part of, we are involved in kind of using our own lived experience throughout the whole kind of process to identify the themes for the workshops, kind of choose the overall theme of the day, design what the experience looks like for participants, and then also delivering them on the day. And I think the biggest thing is the representation that gives young people. Even for me, going to the Youth Voice Matters conference, it feels incredible seeing other young people like yourself making the changes. It makes the impossible feel possible. For a lot of us as young people, we don't have that representation, and seeing other young people on stage like yourself is incredible. But I also think it's the most accessible conference I've ever been to, in terms of it has like a visual facilitator, there's fidget toys everywhere. It is, I think there's a lot of things we need to bring from the Youth Voice Matters conference to all conferences. So it is a very exciting event and part of kind of co-production. Next slide, please. So I originally kind of worked as a young person advisor for a research project called the OACE project. And this is a kind of pilot research project at the University of Oxford, which created an online museum to share kind of the stories of people through time and place as an intervention to sort of improve underrepresented young people's mental health. And the thing that is so exciting about it is the involvement of young people in the project. And particularly sort of in shaping how the intervention was involved and what that looked like. So initially, for example, the platform was going to only have uplifting stories as a way to promote positive mental health. However, from our involvement as young people, this changed kind of the whole outcome, because we were able to say, actually, from our experiences, we want to hear the real life struggles and not shy away from that in this kind of platform and piece of work. And this went kind of through the process, and actually the participants who then took part in the online museum said it was the relatability and authenticity in the stories that made people feel less alone. And participants who kind of used it said that that was one of the things that they think had the biggest benefits. And building on kind of this piece of work, we applied for a kind of bigger grant, which is the Origin project. And I was involved sort of from the beginning, now working to lead the involvement of all the young people on the project. And one of the values I'm going to speak a bit more about later is being bold. From the outset, it was important to be bold in how we embedded young people's involvement across kind of different areas. So we have young people working as peer researchers on the project, as well as like young people's advisory groups. And what I think is really exciting about it is that it is youth-led, with 2 young people coordinating all the young people's involvement, and they kind of lead in organising and facilitating all the meetings and acting as like a bridge for young people and researchers. I think this has really fostered sort of sense of ownership and agency in the project, and it's something I'm really keen to sort of build on in terms of what youth-led leadership looks like as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of what works in terms of co-production, so at the heart of co-production is the relationships, the kind of real human connections. And for me, a key aspect of co-production is shifting the power to include those with lived experience. young people bring with them experiences from other services and interactions with professionals, which may not always be positive. And that's why I think it's so important to spend time early in the process for everyone to get to know each other and build trust. And that might mean starting meetings with an icebreaker, sharing a meal at the end of a workshop, having a WhatsApp group for everyone to communicate, or social kind of opportunities. And I think those things create that belonging and understanding, which is key. Considering the practicalities, so practical considerations really can make or break the co-production process. So one kind of simple but really important aspect of this is scheduling, so ensuring that meetings don't clash with other things that busy young people are often involved in. And we've used WhatsApp polls or doodle polls to give everyone a kind of say in the planning process, and that works really well. There is also travel to think about, so like covering young people's travel costs up front, as well as kind of thinking about other ways to make accessible opportunities. So for example, when sharing opportunities with young people, explaining really clearly and simply what the opportunity involves in language that makes sense. Being bold, so co-production requires boldness. It challenges kind of the traditional power structures, and it requires a kind of commitment from everyone to doing things a bit differently. I think it is important to acknowledge that isn't always easy. It can mean kind of having to bring other professionals along with you and sort of share that process of understanding why it's important. I also think there's something incredibly important about recognizing that it's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay if things don't go perfectly first time. I think it's about evolving and kind of learning and iterating sort of throughout a process. And the best pieces of work I've been involved in weren't necessarily the ones that have got everything right first time, but kind of the ones that were adaptable and sort of open to feedback. Involvement from the start and in different ways. So I think a core principle of co-production that I'm really passionate about is involving people, young people and those with lived experience right from the start of a project. So this might look a bit different depending on what the project is, but for example, ways I've been involved from the start was in like shaping and writing a funding bid for a research project, so that from the beginning I'm involved in kind of identifying what the priorities of the research project are, ensuring that it kind of aligns with young people's needs, and that lived experience is embedded throughout the process. I think early involvement also leads to kind of more investment from young people in terms of knowing what the work is. But I also think involvement shouldn't just end from being involved from the start. I think it's about continuing throughout the project in different ways, and ideally having opportunities that kind of match young people's strengths, interests, and like have the opportunity to develop their sort of skills. And on the project that I work on with Oxford, we have regular kind of check-ins with young people to help reflect together on like what's going well, and talk about any particular areas of interest that people might want to be involved in. Next slide, please. So diverse and kind of intersectional experiences. So I think it's really important when thinking about co-production that we're thinking about the voices that are furthest away from power, those who kind of might be less likely to be heard. And I think a key step in that is recognising and sort of addressing the barriers that might prevent young people from being involved. And when I first joined FLAIR, which is the Department for Education Advisory Group, we had a list of access requirements that we could like request. So that could be things like having a BSL interpreter, having a quiet room, having a chance to like talk through meetings in advance. And I think having like a form like this where you can just ask for the support that you need can be really helpful if you don't necessarily know upfront like what you would specifically need. So I think working like that in quite innovative ways and just thinking about the barriers and how you can address them at the start is really important. I think it's also about being proactive in reaching underrepresented young people. So for example, if there are specific groups that might face barriers to being involved, naming them specifically on recruitment materials so that young people know the opportunity is for them. Otherwise, we might not. I think regular reviews and kind of that opportunity for feedback ensures that young people's experiences kind of remain meaningful and positive, and is about kind of continually reviewing and improving co-production processes. So this could be like using Mentimeter to collect sort of anonymous feedback. Reciprocity. So I think co-production should be not just a one-way process, but like thinking about how young people are genuinely involved, and sort of embedding young people's lived experience throughout a process, and kind of recognizing young people's expertise, kind of their time as well, and kind of compensating young people if you can through things like payment or vouchers or another form of recognition like a group trip. Honesty. So I think it is really important to be honest, and where, for example, you know that there are things that aren't in the scope of the project, or are there things like time limitations, being really upfront about what those are so that young people are able to kind of have their expectations set at the start. Sharing of power. So thinking about actually how are young people who are involved kind of part of the process and really have the kind of autonomy and like part of that decision making all the way through. And then feeding back through to young people, so sharing the impact that young people's involvement has had. This might be like building opportunities into the start of meetings, but really sharing how that has made a difference. Next slide, please. So in terms of the impact on children and young people, I think one of the biggest things is having community of like-minded young people with a passion to make a change. I think that has massive kind of impacts on young people. Developing our own skills. So I think for me, I've learned so many skills in terms of research skills, policy skills, public speaking, all those skills that I now go on to use on a daily basis. Confidence. I feel like a different person now to when I first started getting involved with things. I can talk in front of people that I would never have done before. It's gradually given me the opportunity, and so many other young people, the opportunity to really build our confidence. Hope and purpose. So having that hope and that purpose, and maybe even though we might be able to change our experiences that we've had, hopefully things will be better for the next generation of young people, and that can be a real kind of driving force and purpose for a lot of us as young people. Next slide, please. So the other impacts of co-production. So when young people with lived experience are meaningfully involved, services become kind of more accessible and effective. It means that like policy and services better meet the kind of diverse needs of different young people, and that these kind of needs are reflected in the decisions that are made about us as well. Improved trust. So kind of genuine co-production can lead to increased trust between young people and professionals. It means getting to know people on a human level. And as a young person, I can often tell if services involve young people or have involved kind of young people, and that makes me much more likely to use them. I also think there is an increased kind of understanding of young people as well in terms of the lived experiences, and their needs, and I think it builds a kind of better process. Co-production also brings fresh ideas and new ideas to the table, kind of bringing diverse perspectives and ensuring that lived experience is embedded throughout. I also feel that often this part is missed out, but when staff feel that they're delivering a service that kind of meets the needs of young people, this overall kind of impacts their well-being as well, and makes a big difference to kind of everybody involved. Next slide, please. Brilliant questions.
Louise, thank you so much for sharing that. I loved so much of that, and that focus on being bold as well, I think is such a vital takeaway. I do have a question, but before I jump in, are there any questions from the audience? You're getting a lot of love in the chat, Louise, and yeah, once again, thank you so much. Any questions from people in the room? You might need to put your hand up, and hopefully, if I can't see, someone might be able to. No worries if not. I guess one question that I had is obviously we started to today with a quick Menti about how confident people felt about co-production. I wonder if you had any tips for professionals that are at the very start of that co-production journey. What would be the kind of key thing to take away?
I think I'd say don't be afraid. Like, I know it's quite tricky when you start something new, but I think being open and honest that actually this is something that you're new to is really important. Like, in terms of that relationship building, saying, actually, this is my first time doing this. I'm really open to feedback, really passionate about involving young people's voices, but I recognize that this is an ongoing process. But I think taking the first step is really important, even if it isn't always like the perfect first time. I think is very important. I could also see in the chat about kind of involving young people who aren't necessarily part of different groups. And one of the ways I think that can be really useful to do this is having kind of like conferences or those opportunities which are open to all young people. Like, I know, for example, locally that we've done kind of conferences for young people to come, even if they're not already involved. And I think it's about getting the messages out to the services and organisations that are already working with young people, maybe those that aren't necessarily in education or things like that, and working to kind of involve them through that sort of processes. But also about thinking about service design, even if it isn't necessarily through participation groups. Like, there's different ways, for example, doing like quite fun quizzes and all kind of, there is quite like creative methods of involving young people that don't necessarily require them to be part of a kind of participation group.
Thank you so much, Louise. That's really helpful. Bridget had a question, which was, how did you get involved initially? Were you approached or was it through a group?
Yeah, so for a long time, I'd seen a flyer for a participation group in my local CAMS waiting room. And I was really scared to join because I thought this isn't like for me. But then actually one of the professionals that I was working with at the time said, actually, I really think that you should try it and go along. So I met with the person running the group beforehand and we chatted, and then I kind of built up the courage to go. So I think, that was sort of my process into it, and then gradually began to kind of get involved with more opportunities through that.
Thank you. There was a second question, if that's all right, from Bridget, which was, we want to get our young people more involved in their own EHCPs, education, health and care plans. What would you suggest? Yeah,
so I think there are so many kind of different ways to be involved that I think it is important to not just necessarily think of it as we're all going to sit in a room and talk about an EHCP, because I think that can feel quite daunting for young people. I think having like that creativity side of it, so maybe having a young person have the opportunity to draw something that represents their views, or create a video, or work with somebody else to share their views. I think as well it's about sharing with young people the importance of their view, because I think as young people we don't always necessarily feel that our views have weight, even though they do and they're really important. It can be hard as a young person to feel that way, so it's about sharing with young people kind of why it's important. I also think there could be so much more kind of opportunities for young people to be involved and meet other young people who have been involved with their EHCPs, and that kind of process, and like sharing those like good practice pieces of like what it's like to be a young person involved in your EHCP and things like that. I think like in a big picture kind of way that could be really amazing as well.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask one more, and it's going to, I hope that's all right. It's going to reflect back Victoria's comment in the chat, which the comment in the chat was, I was wondering what the most effective way of working with service users, what gives the best return on investment, I guess, speaking into, I guess, a little bit around monitoring and evaluation of this. Of engagement. no worries if not, Louise, but wondering if you've got any thoughts on that and how you might be able to demonstrate value. You've spoken a lot about a lot about this in many ways already, but just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think ongoing opportunities can be really important in terms of building those relationships. So not just having a one-off thing if you can. I think having things which follow up and young people having the opportunity to kind of hear the impact of their work themselves is really kind of important. But in terms of like being able to demonstrate the impact that it has on us as young people, one of the things that we're trialing in one of the pieces of work at the moment is doing like reflective video logs of the kind of skills that we have learned and like how it is impacting us personally. So we just like record kind of like videos that we can then kind of use going forward to think more widely about the impact on us and being able to kind of evidence that. But I do think it is about being creative, because things like questionnaires might not always be the most kind of engaging format for that kind of work, but having the opportunity to do a video and even doing it kind of in a group together, have everyone having the opportunity to kind of keep that momentum going, could be a really interesting thing to explore.
Louise, thank you so much, and Garling and Mini, thank you also for presenting earlier as well. We are now going to take a 9-minute break, and we are going to come back at 11:15. Victoria, there may be an opportunity to kind of come back in on that question around monitoring and evaluation and demonstrating impact later on. But after the break, we'll hear from Kieran Pearce, who'll speak into the work that they've done in a local area. And I'll see you all at 11:15. Thank you very much, everyone. Morning, everyone. We will be looking to make a restart well, now. We'll be making to look at restart. Hopefully, people are back. If you could maybe put a thumbs up or wave to say that you're here, that would be amazing. Super. Inundated with thumbs up and waves. Thank you. I am going to hand over to our next presenter, who's Kieran Pearce, who is the Multi-School Council Programme Lead at Essex County Council, to take us through some learning from a local area case study. Over to you, Kieran.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam, and thank you everybody for having me here today. Next slide, please. So before I start, I just want to say thank you to the two others that have spoken this morning. It was great to sit and listen to that. In particular, the thing that stood out for me, Louise, when you said that co-production had changed your life, I think that's hopefully why everyone's here today, because it highlights why co-production is so important. So in the time that I've got, I'm going to give you a flavour of the work that we've done through the Multi-Schools Council and the work that the young people have driven forward. In the time I've got, there's no way we can cover everything, but I'm going to give you some links at the end. One of those links is going to be to a case study that was published in December through the What Works in Send network. So we worked alongside ISOS to produce that. And that gives a lot more detail about some of the things that I'm going to cover in the time that I've got today. Next slide, please. So whenever I give a wider presentation about Multi-Schools Council, I always have to start with the young person you can see on the screen. So this is Charlie. Charlie is the reason we set up the Multi-Schools Council in the first place. So my background, I've worked in 2 special schools in Essex. Charlie attended one of those, and she was very passionate about co-production and making sure young people had their voices heard. Charlie's view was that in specialist provision sometimes can be really great, but ultimately a lot of those young people, or all of those young people, are going to leave, and actually other young people and other adults don't understand special educational needs. And that was her view, and that view was shared by some of her friends as well. And what we wanted to do was to try and challenge those negative perceptions around young people with special educational needs. So that's why we set the Multi-Schools Council up in the first place. Charlie is now at university, and she remains an ambassador for the Multi-Schools Council, which I will go into more detail as we come on to some of the other slides. But that's why we set the council up. Next slide. So the easiest way to explain the Multi-Schools Council is in 3 pillars, 3 pillars which have been designed by young people, which basically highlight the different elements of our work. So pillar 1 is what we now call Multi-School Council share zones. They've very recently been changed by young people because they said Multi-School Council meetings sound a bit boring. So share zones is what we now call them. Pillar 2 is the work we do directly in schools. And pillar 3 is our ambassador program, and I'm going to walk you through each of those pillars in this session. Next slide. So, pillar 1, as I've mentioned, is the share zones, and just to give you some context to that. So, Essex is a very big local authority. We're now at the point where we hold share zones at least termly in every single district within Essex. So we have 14 meetings that happen, and we have young people from all provisions attend those meetings. So what the meetings are they are an opportunity for young people to share things that matter to them. So the agendas are set by things that young people tell us are important. So you can see at the moment, some of their core focuses are on things like mental health, crime, and ADHD. And that was from a list of around 30 topics that young people had chosen. And so for the next 2.5 years, they are areas that we'll be focusing on. But there are other things that come up. So recently we've focused on online safety because young people were talking about that. We've also done a lot of work on school attendance because young people are raising that for some of their friends or for some of them. Those coming to school is becoming much more difficult. So this pillar is all about listening to what's important to young people, putting it on an agenda, and then ensuring they have the chance and opportunity to share what they want to share. It's then our job to go and do something about that. So for us, one of the big things around co-production is making sure it doesn't just become a vacuum or a listening chamber, and actually we go and do something about it afterwards. So some of the things that have come from that, we now run anti-bullying assemblies, which kind of feature in Pillar 2, and because young people were saying that one of the biggest barriers to attendance in school was bullying. We now hold an annual United in Diversity event to celebrate diversity. And that again was designed by young people. They chose the location, they chose what should happen there, and that's been developed and built upon year after year. School attendance, we helped create locally a new school attendance board, which focused very much more on the wording and the messaging that young people wanted. I'm not here today to comment on national campaigns around school attendance, but actually young people said things slightly different, and that's where our focus should be. So we were able to develop some resources. Not saying that we've solved all of the challenges around attendance, but we've certainly had some positive feedback from young people about improving attendance. I've seen in the chat that EHCP reviews is something that has been mentioned already today. One piece of work we're working on at the moment is a checklist around not just what a review should look like, but if a young person has a plan, what and how that setting can ensure that works for that young person. One of the biggest bits of feedback we've had from young people is we can focus so much on the review that we forget that that plan should be with them every single day and is part of their life and educational experience or health experience. And so that's something we're trying to make clear through that checklist. And then, as you can see, there are things like the mascot that have been designed through those pillars. So Banjo, if anybody is aware of the dance band Diversity, that's where Banjo came from. So Ashley Banjo is the lead dancer there, and so that's kind of where the name come from, but young people designed it. So that just gives you a flavour of Pillar 1. The final thing to mention on that is that it's about young people's agendas. It's not about professionals saying, oh, we've got this thing that we want young people to comment upon. It's the other way around. It's making sure we then take it up to adults, which we feel is really, really important. Next slide, please. So Pillar 2 is the work we do directly in schools. So again, the real ethos to this is that it must be designed with young people. So we have a number of sessions that we now go and deliver in schools. We have an autism awareness session that has been designed by young people who have autism, and it's delivered to all young people in schools. We also do the same with ADHD, and we have 3 assemblies that we deliver as well. So we have a SEND awareness assembly, anti-bullying assembly, as already mentioned, and a mental health assembly as well. And like I say, the real key to those is that they've been designed with young people who have lived experience, and they're constantly being updated and adapted by our ambassadors as well. What we're aiming for in the future, and we've already seen some of this happen, is that rather than people within our team going and delivering, it's actually young people who feel confident to deliver some of those sessions themselves. And we've started to do that locally as well. And actually, that's so much more impactful to have young people themselves with lived experience delivering the things that they've created. So locally, we're trying to get every single school signed up to the work that we're doing. There are around 612, don't quote me on the exact number. So we are, around 100 off, but we're trying to make sure all the schools are involved there. We do this because young people have said that understanding in school is really crucial. So we think back to Charlie at the start, she said we need to be ensuring we create this awareness in school. If we're going to change society's views around SEND, then it needs to start in school. There are other projects that have linked to that kind of pillar as well. So we ran a self-esteem program, which we trialed with schools. Again, that was designed by young people, a 6-week program. It's now been turned into a manual for local schools to access. And we've had some really positive feedback around boosting self-esteem levels. One of the biggest bits of impact there was a secondary school we'd worked with. There was a young lad who was at risk of exclusion. He got involved in the program, and he has now completed his education at that setting. And they've credited the program to having a real big impact on that. Another project just to mention is the Good Practice Seekers. So young people we worked with designed a framework of what they felt inclusion should look like in schools. They then had some training. They then went and looked at 4 local schools, gave some feedback, and then 2 terms later went back to see if anything had changed. Really great project. Young people are constantly telling me that hashtags are the cool thing. I'm obviously not cool enough to know, but their hashtag for this project was hashtag better than Ofsted. And I love that because actually, you know, Ofsted, I know they have their place, come in for a few days. Actually, what's more important? Young people looking at it themselves. So Louise said to be bold. So we're being bold there. Next slide, please. So just to pause on some feedback that some of the schools and young people have given us from following the school delivery. I'll just let you read that. Just to mention, because it may be a question that comes up around the funding element, all of our work is funded through the local authority, so it's no extra cost to the schools. And I've said really openly, while I'm leading the multi-schools, that will never change, because actually this type of awareness should just be available. It shouldn't be things that schools have to buy in. We feel very passionately about that. So just to highlight that there as well. Next slide. So Pillar 3 is our ambassador program. Actually changed since I've sent this PowerPoint over. We now have 183 young ambassadors, mainly just in Essex, but some just beyond. And basically they're young people who get involved with the Multi-Schools Council, and not just in their schools, but in their communities, really want to challenge those perceptions. We really don't like the word criteria. So there's no criteria. A lot of the young people who get involved do have SEN, but actually we have some who are siblings, we have some who have a friend, some who are just very passionate about making sure that there's more inclusion. And so they really help drive forward the ideas that I've already mentioned. Just to mention a couple of things on the list today. So we now have an Invincible Games, which includes all of the specialist provisions across our local authority and Southend and Thurrock. And they're invited to a sports event where young people basically get involved in a range of different events with local organisations. That came about because one of our ambassadors visited what they called a mainstream school event, and she went up to the organisers and said, how come there's nothing like this special provisions? And then it was introduced. So it shows you the impact there of listening, and hats off to Active Essex, who actually went and did something about it. Another thing just to mention, because we know that it's something that's a bit of a hot topic at the moment, is around school transitions, particularly from year 6 to year 7. Our ambassadors have created a mentoring program where this year they are having a range of schools come and see them. So young people in year 6, and they're going to give advice and support on some of the best things to support that transition from their perspectives. We trialed it last year. It was really impactful, and we've had some great feedback for young people who've gone into year 7. But it's an area that we want to continue developing. Next slide. Again, just to look at some of the feedback from young people, the kind of impact, which is captured more in the case study, which the link will be at the end. Some of these things, or all of these things, actually have already been mentioned. So that diversity is crucial, and just to really kind of home in on that. It needs to be on young people's terms. It's not adults saying, you know, you need to get in involved in X amount of projects or X amount of meetings. It's taking away that pressure and creating a safe place. The young person who gave that last quote there actually did a speech recently to schools about, you know, being an ambassador and the impact it had, which is available on our Facebook page, which I'll give you a link for, but that captures it really well as well. Next slide. So we've built on the Multi-Schools Council network, and we've now been commissioned to run something called Voice of the East, which now engages across 11 different local authorities in the east of England. This group is specifically for young people with SEN. It's what young people wanted, and it's basically looking at trying to gather voice across the east to then influence some of the bigger changes regionally and nationally. I'm not going to talk too much on this page because I'm conscious of time and I really want to share the video. So I'm hoping Adiba is able to get this working. So no pressure, let's be bold. And this captures a big get together event which we held on the 7th of February, which was designed by young people. Next slide, please. So the special ingredients, I think the girl you can see in the right-hand corner there, I think she summed it up at the start and at the end in terms of, she said it was one of the best days of her life, which for us, when we heard that, was like, wow. But also just that kind of positivity. There's so much negativity when we talk about SEND at the moment, and, you know, sometimes rightly, because there are lots of things that could be improved. But actually, we find young people really give us a balanced view. I've read recently that one of the challenges some people can have to accepting co-production is they can see it as a vehicle for raising problems, and that's really the wrong way to look at it. It's actually having that solution focus. So I think that special ingredient around no judgment is crucial. It's their model, it's their time to develop things. Those relationships that have already been highlighted earlier as well, that, you know, remember what they say, feel valued, because that makes them feel valued. Sorry, if you go back to them and say, you know, when you were talking about, you know, your brother or sister getting a new bike last week, how they're getting on with it, it's those things, those little interactions, which will then create and build those relationships. And that buy-in from professionals, which I always say, I always try and compare when we talk about co-production to like things like safeguarding. None of us would ever say safeguarding is not our responsibility. When we're working with children, we know that it's all of our responsibility. We'd say the same with co-production. If we're working with young people, whether that's on the ground or whether that is in an office, actually, surely we all have a duty to ensure we're listening to them. It's not a choice. Next slide. So what's next? And I know I've only got a minute or so, so I'm going to be as brief as I can. But I want to just touch on the Missing Voices project, because some people in the chat earlier mentioned, ensuring we're reaching lots of young people. And so what we've noticed is there are more young people accessing enhanced provisions or alternative provisions, or young people that are home educated. So we've been visiting some of those places, and we're capturing their voices to try and feed back into the system to say what's possibly not working, because their voices are just as needed. The same around young people who may be pre or non-verbal, and we're actually really looking at developing that, and ensuring that young people there as well also have a voice, because we really do need to just increase the diversity of what we're doing. The video highlighted that we really want to try and create a national model. So one of the things we're saying at the moment is, if nationally we have parent carer forums, which absolutely I advocate for as well, so it's not to replace, then we need to do the same with young people. And that's something that we're really championing at the moment as well. Next slide. So I think I've just managed to stick to time, but to give you some further links as well, you can see we do a lot on social media, because young people have said that's the way forward. And so some links there, the link to the full case study, and the young people wrote a book as well, which is called A Toolkit for Teachers, which basically highlights the stuff in Pillar 2. But I will stop talking there and I'll pass back over to Sam. Thank you.
Kieran, thank you so much for that. I hope you sensed the love in the room for what you've been able to develop in Essex and slightly wider in the east of England as well. And particularly, I think the video really showed people how that works in practice. So thank you for sharing that. There are a couple of questions. The first was from Bridget, which was, can I ask for more detail on the self-esteem program? And I know there was a quote in the video which spoke about that sense of belonging, and that if only their voice had been heard earlier. So, Kieran, I wonder if you might be able to speak into that.
Yeah, so to answer it directly, on our website, we have links to the self-esteem manual and the resilience program. So you can find it on there. But that's to expand on that. That's exactly why it started, Sam, was because, and I'm sure people on the call have found this, there are lots of young people, particularly in schools, who have had very negative experiences from peers. And so part of that is really developing their confidence, and the fact that it's been designed by young people who have SEND themselves and have maybe had some of those similar experiences. That's why I think it's impactful for some.
Thank you, Kieran. And the second question, which was in the chat, which I think probably lots of people will be thinking in terms of their local areas, what level of staffing resource manage this programme for Essex?
Yeah, so it's been a journey, and I won't talk too long, but just so you have the context to it, I set it up myself while working in the special school, and that was back in 2012. So just to give realistic expectations, it takes time. It took me 5 years to then get the support from the local authority, where I was then seconded for a day a week to expand it. It then took a couple more years to get the role established within the local authority. At the same time, I registered the multi-schools as a CIC, so community interest company, to really protect the idea. And that's nothing against Essex. I would have done it any local authority, so that it stayed true to the young people and what they wanted. Essex have now given us 2 other full-time staff members, so in total 3 of us. We do now have a staff member that works a day a week in Southend, building the model there. And the likes of Hertfordshire and Suffolk are exploring within their own system how they can use existing staff to develop. Just a pointer on that, though, what we've already found is that to ensure you can reach the 3 pillars, you do need that kind of specific staff resource. Our dream is to get centralised funding, which we can then take to local areas and say, look, get someone full-time to build this. But that's currently where we're at, and that's been the journey.
Kieran, thank you so much for that detail. That's really, really helpful. Are there any more questions? I know there's a little bit of a lag in the chat for me, so I will ask one, and then potentially we might have some others in a second. My question is around how you develop the relationships with schools, and clearly that will be a key part of this journey. But I wonder if you might be able to say a little bit more about that process.
Yeah, you're right. The schools have been absolutely crucial to ensuring, obviously, we can connect with the young people. There is a little bit of what do we get out of this, and I think I have to talk really honestly about that. And learn that over the years that schools have so much, don't they, that's pushed towards them, and so much that's offered. And I guess it's just about showing them the value. So again, it sounds really obvious, but for me, it's about finding the right connection in the school. So adult initially, who can then ensure that they give those opportunities to the young people. Once young people then become ambassadors, so that kind of pillar 3, what we found is young people have communicated that to other young people, friends from other schools. And actually, we have had occasions where both parents and young people have enabled a school to get involved because they've seen the impact it's had on a friend or a relative. So I think it's just about showing the value, and that's why we really believe in pillar 2, the school delivery, because they're getting something back from it as well, that awareness. A lot of staff we speak to, when they talk about educating around SEN, maybe don't always know where to start or feel as confident, but actually the fact that we've got something that's been designed by young people, it gives them something back. So I think it's just that two-way, you scratch our back, we scratch yours, but actually the impact it then has for children is what everybody should want.
Thank you. Yeah, I completely agree, and that's really helpful. Question from Charlotte, which is when and where are share zones held, please? Feel free to answer that one in the chat if that's easier. But yeah.
So there, as I mentioned, in Essex we follow a district model. So they're held at least termly, and then they're held in the local schools. But more recently, we have had young people who have been home educated who have attended. We've had young people from pupil referral units as well, because we try to create an environment where any young person is accepted. It doesn't matter who they are, age, whatever. And then the way we run it is they're an hour and a half. We have a break in between. So it's very much focusing on the questions, but we've held them in special schools before, for example. And one of the big things there is that when a young person walks into a specialist environment and they're from a mainstream school, they leave with their perception completely changed. And we've seen examples of that. We've had young people say things like, I didn't know young people with autism could speak, or I thought everybody who has ADHD is the same. Like, it's those different things which actually the share zones are about voice, yes, but it's more about challenging those perceptions as well.
Thank you. Okay, I've got one more question, if that's all right. And I'm going to borrow from Louise's presentation, where she mentioned the importance of engaging and involving those furthest away from power. And Jenny in the chat earlier mentioned around those that aren't maybe part of a recognised co-production group, if you like. How do you mentioned diversity, and I guess the question is, how do you ensure that you get a really broad representation and a diverse group?
Well, I think it's about going to them. So I know a lot of this is around on the capacity, and I appreciate we can set things up sometimes where we want young people to come along, and they're still important, but actually some young people, maybe they won't want to leave their house, maybe they won't want to leave the group they found, whether that's an alternative provision, whether that's a youth group, whatever it is. And actually, why should we expect them to come to us all the time? So I think I know I haven't got long enough today to talk about missing voices work, but that is basically what we are trying to do. So literally after this, I'm going to visit an alternative provision. So they do horse riding, because there are young people there that would not feel confident to be an ambassador or even join anything virtually, but actually they've still got some really strong messages and things they want to share. So I think it's about going to them, and to echo what Louise said, being bold. Don't get caught up in red tape. Yes, we need to ensure young people are safe, but actually we need to make sure as well we're doing it in a way that works for them.
Thank you, Kieran. That's absolutely brilliant. And we often speak about and hear about a SEN system in crisis or at breaking point, and it's really wonderful to be able to speak about the positives and to hear what is working in a local area, to really engage, involve and co-produce with young people. So thank you for sharing that story and that piece of kind of work that you've engaged over a long time. And I think that's another thing that I really took away. Time is is a key part of this, and doing this properly, doing this right takes time. So thank you so much for sharing. We now have a bit of time in our agenda for reflections from the group, and it may be a question that you have about any of the 3 talks that we've had, or co-production more generally. If you want to kind of reflect anything, either write something in the chat and I'll read it out, or alternatively, if you're able to raise your virtual hand, that would be great, and I can come to you. And it's absolutely fine if there isn't any particular reflections. Victoria.
And I wondered if I could come back to the question I asked earlier about, like, how do you get your best bang for your buck when doing co-production or any sort of participation? I'm chair of a parent carer forum, so I do participation all day, every day. And some days we get a maximum of about 10 people to events online, going to coffee mornings, but more often than not is a lot less than the 10. We're trying so hard to do everything, to work out what it is that's the best way of gathering the voices and bringing together the professionals and the service users. But yeah, we still haven't found like the magic answer yet. So I'd be really interested if anybody's got any ideas of things that have really worked really well for them.
Absolutely, thank you. I wonder if anyone wants to come in on that. Minu.
Hiya. I think there isn't it's not a silver bullet. There's not sort of one place or one event or one, sort of occasion. And I think it's about going out to the community. I think Kieran was just saying about going to where people are. And I think some of the good examples that I've been hearing are people who are making contact with other communities. So they might be going to the mosque, they might be going to the churches, they might be going to, a particular women's group that meets in a particular place and already does something. So it's about capturing people, not capturing, but getting to accessing people where they already are and where they feel comfortable, because going to a parent carer forum may not be in everybody's kind of capacity to do. It takes a lot of confidence to come to those things, and we don't always realize when we have that confidence or we host those things that actually that's very simple for us to do, but it's not everyone's habitus. So I think it's about meeting people where they're at. But yeah, it's not cheap and it's not quick and it's not easy, but I think it's vital if we want to have the services that we need.
Thank you, Minu. Charlotte?
Thank you.
I just wanted to come in on that point, actually. I work in Surrey County Council and we've been looking at our participation model and co-production, etc. And we had our Ofsted inspection about 18 months ago. And one of the things that came through clearly was that people want access to things locally, and they don't want to join a parent carer forum, etc. So we're looking at how we go to things that already exist, like you said, faith groups, cultural things, those kinds of things, and also through people that already engage with families and young people. So if young people are going to a basketball club, how can we link with that? We're very early days of this, and I've just got a colleague that's joined me to do a lot of this work. So we need to get out there and do it. And I'm not saying it's easy to do, but I think it is going to people, not them coming to us, that is the answer. And it's quite hard to do that. And we just need to make the time and build in that work that's needed. And sometimes that's not a priority for us in councils, unfortunately. And we just have to recognise that, in challenging times, this sometimes goes down the list of things to do, but we have to keep on raising the profile and saying this is what we need to do.
Thank you, Charlotte, for reflecting that and sharing that. That's really helpful. And Kieran also mentioned in the chat, keep showing up even if it's one person that's one person more than would have been heard before, and that's absolutely right. And Victoria, if I can also just come in on your question around kind of bang for your buck, if you like. I guess when we look at that, it's for us when we're working with local areas, it's about supporting them to think about, well, how do you measure what is the bang for the buck, if you like? How do you measure? How do you monitor what that really looks like? How do you tell whether it's working? And I will share one resource, which is also from the What Works in Send website. And the reason that I'm sharing that one, it's genuine partnerships and the four cornerstones approach, which people may have come across before. And the reason that I think there's something in particular there is that talks about co-production as a relationship, and that underneath it all, if there's not trust between the partners involved, then it will break down and it will not be successful, and you will not get bang for your buck, if you like. And I think there might be some learnings through that, but I also agree with Mina that there probably isn't a silver bullet, if you like, to address this. And I think the fact that Kieran spoke about starting that piece of work in 2012 shows how long this takes. But for us, it's about creating, I guess that for us at CDC, we talk a lot about it being a relationship and developing that trust over years and years with your parent carer forum, with parent carer community more widely, with children and young people in your community that have special educational needs, and wider than that as well. I wonder if there's thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree around thinking about the impact that relational practice and trauma-informed practice can have on that. I think we really see trying to understand why things might have broken down is really valuable to moving things forward and being solution focused as well. Okay, are there any other reflections that people would like to come in on? In which case, Adiba, if it's all right, we'll move on. We've had today from 4 different speakers, and thank you so much. And I just want to really share my appreciation for sharing. Minu and Garling, thank you for giving us that really clear evidence base of what works when it comes to what good co-production looks and feels like. Louise, thank you so much for sharing that message of being bold and really speaking into the kind of experience from your perspective. And finally, Kieran, thank you for giving us some tools and some tips and how local areas might want to go about this themselves. But we wanted to just give you a quote to finish on, which is, if you want to know how well a pair of shoes fit, you ask the person wearing them, not the person who made them or the person who paid for them. And we often use this quote as just a way of reminding us what this is all about, why we co-produce, why we involve, and why we try and engage people. Adiba, next slide, if that's all right. Okay, final well, two more slides, and one if I can ask you one more time to scan a QR code. Well, I'm about to ask another time as well, but anyway. And we'll just have a quick check back in on the Menti that we started with, and we'll ask you to do exactly the same kind of 2 questions, if that's all right with everyone. Fantastic. Thank you, Adib, for sharing these. I guess the aim of today was to hopefully give a greater understanding of what good co-production looks and feels like. So that's good that we're moving forward on that. That's great. And the second one, Adiba, if it's all right. And also on that second question of hopefully providing people with a little bit more confidence around co-producing within their own role. I can see we've at least made some progress. So thank you so much to everyone for taking part in that little Mentimeter. Thank you. And next slide, please, Adiba. Thank you. And finally, we do have an evaluation form. We would really appreciate the feedback, and there's an opportunity to give feedback to those that have spoken as well, which will help us really make these webinars as effective as possible in the future. If we could put that in the chat, which I can see that Hannah's done, thank you for that. That's really helpful. We hope that today has given you some food for thought and some tools and some tips for successfully and effectively co-producing and engaging children, young people and families in your areas. But please reach out to us for any other questions that you have. Finally, thank you so much again to all the speakers, and thanks everyone for coming along. We will leave it there. We will be sending out the slides off the back of this. We'll also send you the fun terminology game as well. But thank you everyone for coming. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and thank you once again to the brilliant speakers for taking part. Thank you everyone. Hilary, did you have a question? No, that's all right.